I still remember the day Sam and I decided to explore Pendle Hill. We'd been planning this trip for months, poring over maps and research on the notorious hill's dark history. As we arrived at the base of the hill, a sense of excitement and trepidation coursed through my veins. The air was heavy with an eerie energy that seemed to vibrate through every molecule in our bodies. We'd heard stories about Pendle Hill's paranormal activity, whispers of ghostly apparitions, disembodied voices, and unexplained phenomena that drove explorers to madness. I couldn't help but wonder if we were brave enough to uncover the truth behind it all. As we began our ascent, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky transformed into a deep, foreboding crimson, like the very earth itself was bleeding. We trudged on, our footsteps echoing off the hillsides as the silence grew thicker and more oppressive. I glanced over at Sam, his eyes fixed intently on the path ahead. He seemed undaunted by the ominous atmosphere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We'd brought all the necessary gear, cameras, audio recorders, and a few carefully selected ghost hunting gadgets. But as the darkness deepened, I wondered if these tools would be enough to protect us from the forces that lurked in the shadows. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending shivers down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the summit before nightfall. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder, heavy with an otherworldly presence that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but feel that we were trespassing on sacred ground, a place where the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. The trees seemed to twist and writhe around us, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch us back down into the darkness. We finally reached the summit, just as the stars began to twinkle in the sky. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of darkening landscape stretching out before us like an endless sea of shadows. But as I gazed out at the beauty, I felt a creeping sense of unease. We were not alone on Pendle Hill. I could feel it in my bones, a presence that watched us with cold, calculating eyes. Sam and I exchanged a nervous glance, our hearts pounding in unison. We knew we had to press on, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden beneath this haunted hill. But as we stood there, bathed in the faint moonlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded towards some unknown fate, a fate that would forever change us. As we began to explore the summit, the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the creaks and groans of the old trees. The wind howled through the gaps in the rocks, sending shivers down my spine. Sam and I moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing off the hillsides as we searched for any sign of paranormal activity. We'd brought along a few ghost hunting gadgets, but so far, nothing seemed to be working. The EMF meter remained steady, the infrared camera picked up only faint heat signatures, and the digital recorder captured only static. It was as if the hill itself was deliberately suppressing any evidence of its supernatural nature. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on us from the shadows. The wind died down, and for a moment, an unsettling stillness fell over the landscape. I felt Sam's gaze on me, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. We were not alone. We continued to explore, our flashlights casting flickering shadows on the rocks. Every so often, one of us would catch sight of something out of the corner of their eye, a movement, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the reach of the light. But whenever we turned to look, there was nothing. It was as if the hill itself was playing tricks on us. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, heavy with an unseen malevolence that seemed to seep into our bones. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert as we pushed deeper into the heart of Pendle Hill. We were getting close to something, I was sure of it, but what? I had no idea. Suddenly, Sam stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. Sam didn't answer, just kept staring into the darkness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that we were not alone on this hill. And then, without warning, the wind picked up again, howling through the rocks like a chorus of restless spirits. The trees creaked and swayed, their branches reaching out towards us like skeletal fingers. I knew in that moment that we had to get off the hill, but it was too late. The darkness seemed to be closing in around us, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. I couldn't breathe, my heart racing with fear as the wind grew louder and more intense. Sam's eyes were fixed on something ahead, his face pale and drawn with a mixture of fear and determination. I took a step forward, my footfall echoing off the rocks. "Sam," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. I was alone, surrounded by an unseen presence that seemed to be drawing me closer to some unknown fate. The wind died down, and for a moment there was silence. Then, in the distance, I heard a faint whisper, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to be calling my name. As the whisper seemed to fade away, I felt a chill run down my spine. Sam's eyes were still fixed on something in the distance, his face set in a determined expression. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. The wind had died down, and an unsettling stillness had fallen over the landscape. It was as if the hill itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took a step forward, my footfall echoing off the rocks. "Sam," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. I tried again, this time louder. "Sam," I shouted, but there was no answer. Suddenly, Sam's eyes snapped back into focus, and he turned to me with a look of alarm on his face. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs. "I thought you saw something," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Sam's expression changed from fear to confusion. He looked around us, as if taking in our surroundings for the first time. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. The sky was a deep, foreboding gray, and the air was heavy with an electric charge that made my skin tingle. "What do you mean?" Sam asked, his voice still shaking slightly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. "I thought you saw something out there," I said, nodding towards the distance. Sam's eyes followed mine, but he saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, no movement of any kind. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. What was going on? Why did I think I heard a voice? And why did Sam seem so scared all of a sudden? In a daze we stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I noticed something strange. The trees around us seemed to be shifting. The branches were moving, twisting and turning in ways that defied explanation. And I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the hill itself was changing. The rocks beneath our feet seemed to be shifting, like they were alive. And then, without warning, the ground gave way beneath us. And we fell, tumbling through the air with no sense of gravity or direction. It was like we were plummeting into a dark abyss, with nothing but darkness and silence for company. And then, suddenly, we landed. And I sat up, gasping for breath. Sam was beside me, his eyes wide with fear. We were in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around us like a vice. The air was heavy with an electric charge, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "And what just happened?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "but I think we're not alone on this hill." As we sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to this hill than met the eye. Sam seemed equally unsettled, his eyes scanning the trees as if searching for answers. "We need to get out of here," he said finally, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. I nodded in agreement, standing up and brushing myself off. As we made our way back through the forest, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. We didn't speak much, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we emerged into the sunlight that I saw it, an old sign, weathered and worn, nailed to a tree trunk. "Pendle Hill, site of ancient rituals," it read, the words seeming to leap off the page. Sam's eyes met mine, his expression a mixture of fascination and fear. "What do you think this means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." As if on cue, a faint hum began to emanate from the hill itself. It started as a low vibration but quickly grew in intensity until it felt like the very earth was humming beneath our feet. Sam grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with alarm. "What's happening?" he shouted over the din. I shook my head, equally baffled. "I don't know." But then, as if summoned by some unseen force, a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall and imposing, its features obscured by shadows. "Welcome to Pendle Hill," it said, its voice low and gravelly. "We've been waiting for you." As the figure stepped forward, its features became clearer. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with long silver hair that cascaded down her back like a river of moonlight. Her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly intelligence, and her skin seemed to absorb the light around her, making her almost invisible in the dappled shade of the trees. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to take in every detail of this strange creature. The woman's gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt like she was seeing right through me. "I am Ariana," she said, her voice low and husky. "And you are?" Sam stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the woman with a mixture of fascination and wariness. "We're explorers," he said, trying to sound confident. Ariana's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. But then it was gone, and she turned back to me. "I have been waiting for you," she said, her voice dripping with an unsettling intimacy. "You have come to Pendle Hill seeking answers, but are you prepared for the truth?" The air around us seemed to grow heavier, as if the very woods themselves were listening in on our conversation. I felt a shiver run down my spine as Ariana's eyes seemed to bore into my soul. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ariana's gaze never wavered. "Pendle Hill has a history that goes back centuries," she said, her voice low and mysterious. "A history of ritual and sacrifice, of blood and fire." As she spoke, the trees around us seemed to lean in, as if they were trying to listen in on our conversation. I felt like we were being pulled into some dark and ancient world, one that few people ever got to see. And yet, despite the sense of unease growing inside me, I couldn't help but feel drawn to Ariana, to this mysterious figure who seemed to hold secrets and stories that only she knew. As Ariana spoke, the air around us seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening and twisting into grotesque shapes. I felt a shiver run down my spine as she continued to speak, her words painting a vivid picture of a dark and troubled history. But it was what happened next that left me with a sense of utter dread. Ariana's eyes flashed with a fierce intensity, and she raised her hands to the sky. The air around us seemed to shimmer and distort, like the surface of a pond on a summer's day. And then, in an instant, everything went white. I felt myself being pulled through a vortex of color and sound, my senses reeling as I was transported to a place that was both familiar and yet completely alien. When my vision finally cleared, I found myself standing in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees towered above me, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. And then I saw her. A woman in white, her face twisted into a mask of rage and sorrow. She glided towards me with an unhurried pace, her eyes fixed on mine with a cold, calculating gaze. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice like a knife slicing through the air. I tried to speak, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The woman's gaze seemed to bore into my very soul as if she could see every secret and fear that I had ever hidden. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the woman vanished. I was left standing alone in the forest, the trees looming above me like sentinels. But it was what happened next that would haunt me for the rest of my days. As I stood there trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman in white seemed to be haunting my every step, and I knew I had to find out more about her and the mysterious curse that surrounded Pendle Hill. Ariana seemed to sense my unease, and she appeared beside me once again. "You have seen the lady in white," she said, her voice low and serious. "She is a sign of the curse that has been laid upon this hill for centuries." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened to her words. "What kind of curse?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ariana's gaze seemed to cloud over, and she hesitated before speaking. "It is an ancient curse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One that was laid upon the hill by a witch who was wronged in life." I felt a surge of curiosity, and I leaned forward, eager to hear more. Ariana continued, "The witch, whose name was Elizabeth, was a healer and a seer. She lived on Pendle Hill centuries ago, and she was loved and respected by the people of the village." I nodded, intrigued, as Ariana continued. "But there was someone who sought to do her harm, a rival healer named James. He was jealous of Elizabeth's gifts, and he sought to destroy her reputation and her life." My eyes widened in shock as I listened to Ariana's words. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ariana's gaze seemed to bore into my very soul. "Elizabeth was accused of witchcraft," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "She was tried and convicted, and she was sentenced to death." I felt a surge of outrage at the thought of such injustice, and I knew that I had to find out more about Elizabeth's story. "Where can I learn more?" I asked Ariana, my eyes locked on hers. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I will take you to the ancient ruins that lie at the heart of Pendle Hill," she said. "There, you will find the truth about Elizabeth and the curse that was laid upon this hill." As we made our way deeper into the heart of Pendle Hill, the air grew thick with an eerie silence. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. I could feel Ariana's eyes on me, her gaze piercing and intense. And then, without warning, a faint sound began to echo through the forest, the soft, melancholy whistle of a lonely traveler. It was a sound that sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a sense of unease wash over me. "What is it?" I asked Ariana, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the trees seemed to part, revealing a figure standing at the edge of a clearing. He was a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a face that seemed to be carved from stone. And then, as we watched, he began to move towards us, his long strides eating up the distance between us. "Who is this?" I breathed, my voice barely audible. Ariana's gaze never wavered from the figure's face. "He is one of the lost souls," she said, her voice low and grave. "A traveler who stumbled into the curse that surrounds Pendle Hill. The man drew closer, his eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. And then, as he reached us, he spoke, a low, raspy voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Welcome to Pendle Hill," he said, his words dripping with malevolence. "You will never leave." As I watched, the man reached out a bony hand and grasped my arm, his touch sending shivers down my spine. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and menacing. Ariana stepped forward, her eyes flashing with warning. "Don't follow him," she said, her voice low and urgent. But it was too late. The man had already pulled me towards the old mine shaft, its entrance a dark and yawning maw in the side of the hill. I felt a surge of fear as I was dragged towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. Ariana followed close behind, her eyes fixed on the man's face with a mixture of anger and sadness. As we descended into the depths of the mine shaft, the air grew colder and darker, the only sound the echo of our footsteps off the cold stone walls. The man led us deeper into the mine, his pace slow and deliberate. I could feel Ariana's tension growing, her body tense with anticipation. And then, without warning, we stumbled upon a hidden chamber deep within the mine shaft. It was a vast underground cavern, lit by flickering torches that cast eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, a figure sat hunched over, its back to us. The man pushed me forward, his bony hand grasping my arm once more. "Welcome home," he said, his voice dripping with malice. As I stumbled towards the figure, Ariana stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the stone walls. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that was both familiar and yet utterly alien. It was Elizabeth's face, or at least it looked like hers. But there was something wrong, something that sent shivers down my spine. The eyes were black as coal and the skin was deathly pale. "This is where I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice low and husky. "Welcome to your new home." As she spoke, the room began to spin around me, the torches flickering wildly as if trying to escape. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling with terror. And then everything went black. As I regained consciousness, I found myself in a dimly lit chamber deep within the mine shaft. Elizabeth sat beside me, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity. "You should have stayed out of this," she hissed, her voice like a snake slithering through grass. Ariana stood tall, her eyes blazing with fury. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice firm but controlled. Elizabeth's gaze flicked to Ariana, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "I am performing the ritual," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "The one that will bring back my beloved." I felt a surge of fear as I realized what was happening. Elizabeth's eyes seemed to hold a dark power, a power that drew me in like a moth to flame. Ariana stepped forward, her hand reaching out as if to stop Elizabeth. But it was too late. The ritual had begun, and the air was thick with an eerie energy. I watched in horror as Elizabeth began to chant, her voice weaving a spell of darkness and despair. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening into dark pools that sucked all the light out of the air. And then, without warning, the air was filled with the scent of incense, a sweet and sickly smell that made my stomach churn. I stumbled backwards, my eyes fixed on Elizabeth's hands as they began to move in a slow, ritualistic dance. Her fingers were stained with blood, and I realized that she had been sacrificing someone else or something else all along. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew that I had to get out of there before it was too late. But as I turned to flee, I felt a hand grasp my arm, holding me in place. It was the man who had brought me here, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The ritual is almost complete." And with that, everything went black again. As I regained consciousness for the second time that day, I found myself back in the mine shaft, but something was different. The air was thick with an eerie energy, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Ariana stood over me, her eyes wild and unhinged. "You have to get out of here," she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy as if rooted to the spot. The man who had brought me here loomed over me, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. Elizabeth sat beside him, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity. "You're one of us now," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. I felt my mind slipping, my grip on reality tenuous at best. The room began to spin around me, the torches flickering wildly as if trying to escape. I stumbled backwards, my eyes fixed on Ariana's face. She was changing, her features melting away like wax in a furnace. Her eyes turned black as coal and her skin became deathly pale. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but it was too late. The ritual had taken hold, and I felt myself being drawn into its vortex of madness. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched like a puppet on a string. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of recognition. She was me, or at least she was the darker, twisted version of myself that lurked deep within my own mind. The man's voice whispered in my ear, "Welcome home." And with that, everything went black once more. As I slumped to the ground, my vision began to fade. Elizabeth's eyes gleamed with triumph as she reached out to claim me. But Ariana intervened, her voice a fierce cry that shattered the spell. "No," she shouted, flinging herself at Elizabeth. The two women clashed, their bodies twisting and contorting in a blur of motion. I watched in horror as they fought, their hands weaving intricate patterns in the air. The man who had brought me here stood back, his eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. "The ritual is complete," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You are one of us now." But Ariana's cry was a final, desperate bid for escape. She summoned a burst of energy that sent Elizabeth flying across the room. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling with confusion. The man raised his hands, and a blast of dark energy shot towards me. I felt myself being lifted off the ground, suspended in midair as the man's eyes blazed with power. "You will never leave this place," he hissed. But Ariana's voice was a counterpoint to his, a piercing cry that cut through the darkness. "No," she shouted, her body glowing with an otherworldly energy. The room seemed to shudder, the very fabric of reality tearing apart. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When I came to, I was alone. The mine shaft was silent and still, the only sound the soft rustle of dust motes in the air. But as I stumbled to my feet, I knew that I would never be the same again. I had gazed into the abyss, and the abyss had gazed back into me.